Chapter 13. We turn to ask why quantity is not included among the primary genera, and quality also. Quantity is not among the primaries because these are permanently associated with being. Motion is bound up with actual being an act, since it is its life. With motion, stability too gained its foothold in reality. With these are associated difference and identity, so that they are also seen in conjunction with being. But number, the basis of quantity, is a posterior. It is posterior not only with regard to these genera, but also within itself. In number, the posterior is divided from the prior. This is a sequence in which the posteriors are latent in the priors, and do not appear simultaneously. Number, therefore, cannot be included among the primary genera. Whether it constitutes a genus at all remains to be examined. Magnitude, extended quantity, is in a still higher degree posterior and composite, for it contains within itself number, line, and surface. Now, if continuous magnitude derives its quantity from number, and number is not a genus, how can magnitude hold that status? Besides, magnitudes, like numbers, admit of priority and posteriority. If, then, quantity be constituted by a common element in both number and magnitude, we must ascertain the nature of this common element, and consider it, once discovered, as a posterior genus, not as one of the primaries, thus failing of primary status. It must be related, directly or indirectly, to one of the primaries. We may take it as clear that it is the nature of quantity to indicate a certain quantum, and to measure the quantum of the particular. Quantity is, moreover, in a sense, itself a quantum. But if the quantum is the common element in number and magnitude, either we have number as a primary with magnitude derived from it, or else number must consist of a blending of motion and stability, while magnitude will be a form of motion, or will originate in motion, motion going forth to infinity, and stability creating the unit by checking that advance. But the problem of the origin of number and magnitude, or rather how they subsist and are conceived, must be held over. It may thus be found that number is among the primary genera, while magnitude is posterior and composite, or that number belongs to the genus stability, while magnitude must be consigned to motion. But we propose to discuss all this at a later stage. Chapter 14. Why is quality, again, not included among the primaries? Because, like quantity, it is a posterior, subsequent to substance. Primary substance must necessarily contain quantity and quality as its consequence. It cannot owe its subsistence to them, or require them for its completion. That would make it posterior to quality and quantity. Now, in the case of composite substances, those constituted from diverse elements, number and qualities provide a means of differentiation. The qualities may be detached from the common core around which they are found to group themselves, but in the primary genera, there is no distinction to be drawn between simples and composites. The difference is between simples and those entities which complete not a particular substance, but substance such as. A particular substance may very well receive completion from quality, for though it already has substance before the accession of quality, its particular character is external to substance. But in substance itself, all the elements are substantial. Nevertheless, we venture to assert elsewhere that while complements of substance are only by analogy called qualities, yet accessions of external origin and subsequent to substance are really qualities. That further, the properties which inhere in substances are their activities, acts, while those which are subsequent are merely modifications or passions. We now affirm that the attributes of the particular substance are never complementary to substance as such. An accession of substance does not come to the substance of man qua man. He is, on the contrary, substance in a higher degree before he arrives at differentiation. just as he is already living being before he passes into the rational species. Chapter 15. How, then, do the four genera complete substance without qualifying it or particularizing it? It has been observed that being is primary, and it is clear that none of the four, motion, stability, difference, identity, is distinct from it. That this motion does not produce quality is doubtless also clear, but a word or two will make it clearer still. If motion is the act of substance, and being and the primaries in general are its act, then motion is not an accidental attribute, as the act of what is necessarily actual, what necessarily involves act. It is no longer to be considered as the complement of substance, but as substance itself. For this reason, then, it has not been assigned to a posterior class or referred to quality, but has been made contemporary with being. The truth is not that being first is and then takes motion, first is and then acquires stability. Neither stability nor motion is a mere modification of being. Similarly, identity and difference are not later additions. Being did not grow into plurality. Its very unity was a plurality. But plurality implies difference, and unity in plurality involves identity. Substance, real being, requires no more than these five constituents. But when we have to turn to the lower sphere, we find other principles giving rise no longer to substance as such, but to quantitative substance and qualitative. These other principles may be regarded as genera, but not primary genera. Chapter 16. As for relation, manifestly an offshoot, how can it be included among primaries? Relation is a thing ranged against thing. It is not self-pivoted, but looks outward. Place and date are still more remote from being. Place denotes the presence of one entity within another, so that it involves a duality, but a genus must be a unity, not a composite. Besides, place does not exist in the higher sphere, and the present discussion is concerned with the realm of true being. Whether time is there remains to be considered. Apparently, it has less claim than even place. If it is a measurement, and that a measurement of motion, we have two entities. The whole is a composite and posterior to motion. Therefore, it is not on equal footing with motion in our classification. Action and passivity presuppose motion. If, then, they exist in the higher sphere, they each involve a duality. Neither is a simplex. Possession is a duality, while situation, as signifying one thing situated in another, is a threefold conception. Chapter 17. Why are not beauty, goodness, and the virtues, together with knowledge and intelligence, included among the primary genera? If by goodness we mean the first, what we call the principle of goodness, the principle of which we can predicate nothing, giving it this name only because we have no other means of indicating it, then goodness clearly can be the genus of nothing. This principle is not affirmed of other things. If it were, each of these would be goodness itself. The truth is that it is prior to substance, not contained in it. If, on the contrary, we mean goodness as a quality, no quality can be ranked among the primaries. Does this imply that the nature of being is not good? Not good to begin with in the sense in which the first is good, but in another sense of the word. Moreover, being does not possess its goodness as a quality, but as a constituent. But the other genera too, we said, are constituents of being, and are regarded as genera because each is a common property found in many things. If, then, goodness is similarly observed in every part of substance or being, or in most parts, why is goodness not a genus, and a primary genus? Because it is not found identical in all the parts of being, but appears in degrees, first, second, and subsequent, whether it be because one part is derived from another, posterior from prior, or because All are posterior to the transcendent unity, different parts of being participating in it in diverse degrees, corresponding to their characteristic natures. If, then, we make goodness a genus as well as a transcendent source, it will be a posterior genus, for goodness is posterior to substance and posterior to what constitutes the generic notion of being. However, unfailingly, it be found associated with being. But the primaries, we decided, belong to being as such, and go to form substance. This indeed is why we posit that which transcends being, since being and substance cannot be a plurality, necessarily comprising the genera enumerated, and therefore forming a one and many. It is true that we do not hesitate to speak of the goodness inherent in being, when we are thinking of that act by which being tends, of its nature, towards the one. Thus, we affirm goodness of it in the sense that it is thereby molded into the likeness of the good. But if this goodness inherent in being is an act directed towards the good, it is the life of being. But this life is motion, and motion is already one of the genera. Chapter 18. To pass to the consideration of beauty, if by beauty we mean the primary beauty, the same or similar arguments will apply here as to goodness. And if the beauty in the ideal form is, as it were, an effulgence from that primary beauty, we may observe that it is not identical in all participants, and that an effulgence is necessarily a posterior. If we mean the beauty which identifies itself with substance, this has been covered in our treatment of substance. If again we mean beauty in relation to ourselves as spectators in whom it produces a certain experience, this act of production is motion, and none the less motion by being directed towards absolute beauty. Knowledge again is motion originating in the self. It is the observation of being, an act, not a state. Hence it too falls under motion, or perhaps more suitably under stability, or even under both. If under both, knowledge must be thought of as a complex, and if a complex, is posterior. Intelligence, since it connotes intelligent being, and comprises the total of existence, cannot be one of the genera. The true intelligence, or intellect, is being taken with all its concomitants, with the other four genera. It is actually the sum of all the existent entities. Being, on the contrary, stripped of its concomitants, may be counted as a genus and held to an element in intelligence. Justice and self-control, soprosune, and virtue in general, these are all various acts of intelligence. They are consequently not primary genera, they are posterior to a genus, that is to say, they are species. Chapter 19. Having established our four primary genera, it remains for us to inquire whether each of them of itself alone produces species, and especially, can being be divided independently, that is, without drawing upon the other genera? Surely not. The differentiae must come from outside the genus differentiated. They must be differentiae of being proper, but cannot be identical with it. Where then is it to find them? Obviously not in non-beings. If then in beings, and the three genera are all that is left, clearly it must find them in these, by conjunction and couplement with these, which will come into existence simultaneously with itself. But if all come into existence simultaneously, what else is produced but that amalgam of all existent entities which we have just considered, intellect? How can other things exist over and above this all-including amalgam? And if all the constituents of this amalgam are genera, how do they produce species? How does motion produce species of motion? Similarly with stability and the other genera. A word of warning must here be given against sinking the various genera in their species, and also against reducing the genus to a mere predicate, something merely seen in the species. The genus must exist at once in itself and in its species. It blends, but it must also be pure. In contributing along with the other genera to form substance, it must not destroy itself. There are problems here that demand investigation. But since we identified the amalgam of the existent entities or primary genera with the particular intellect, intellect as such being found identical with being or substance, and therefore prior to all the existent entities, which may be regarded as its species or members, we may infer that the intellect, considered as completely unfolded, is a subsequent. Our treatment of this problem may serve to promote our investigation. We will take it as a kind of example, and with it embark upon our inquiry. Chapter 20. We may thus distinguish two phases of intellect, in one of which it may be taken as having no contact whatever with particulars and no act upon anything. Thus, it is kept apart from being a particular intellect. In the same way, science is prior to any of its constituent species, and the specific science is prior to any of its component parts. Being none of its particulars, it is the potentiality of all. Each particular, on the other hand, is actually itself, but potentially the sum of all the particulars. And as with the specific science, so with science as a whole. The specific sciences lie in potentiality in science the total. Even in their specific character, they are potentially the whole. They have the whole predicated of them, and not merely a part of the whole. At the same time, science must exist as a thing in itself, unharmed by its divisions. So with intellect. Intellect as a whole must be thought of as prior to the intellects actualized as individuals. But when we come to the particular intellects, we find that what subsists in the particulars must be maintained from the totality. The intellect subsisting in the totality is a provider for the particular intellects, is the potentiality of them. It involves them as members of its universality, while they in turn involve the universal intellect in their particularity, just as the particular science involves science the total. The great intellect we maintain exists in itself, and the particular intellects in themselves, yet the particulars are embraced in the whole, and the whole in the particulars. The particular intellects exist by themselves and in another, the universal by itself and in those. All the particulars exist potentially in that self-existent universal, which actually is the totality. Potentially, each isolated member, on the other hand, each particular, is actually what it is, its individual self, potentially the totality. Insofar as what is predicated of them is their essence, they are actually what is predicated of them. But where the predicate is a genus, they are that only potentially. On the other hand, the universal, insofar as it is a genus, is the potentiality of all its subordinate species, though none of them in actuality. All are latent in it. But because its essential nature exists in actuality before the existence of the species, it does not submit to be itself particularized. If, then, the particulars are to exist in actuality, to exist, for example, as species, the cause must lie in the act radiating from the universal. Chapter 21. How, then, does this universal intellect produce the particulars, while, in virtue of its reason principle, remaining a unity? In other words, how do the various grades of being, as we call them, arise from the four primaries? Here is this great, this infinite intellect, not given to idle utterance, but to sheer intellection, all-embracing, integral, no part, no individual. How, we ask, can it possibly be the source of all this plurality. Number, at all events, it possesses in the objects of its contemplation. It is thus one and many, and the many are powers, wonderful powers, not weak, but, being pure, supremely great, and, so to speak, full to overflowing powers, in very truth, knowing no limit, so that they are infinite, infinity, magnitude absolute. As we survey this magnitude, with the beauty of being within it, and the glory and light around it, all contained in intellect, we see simultaneously quality already in bloom, and along with the continuity of its act, we catch a glimpse of magnitude at rest. Then, with 1, 2, and 3 in intellect, magnitude appears as of 3 dimensions, with quantity entire. Quantity thus given, and quality both merging into one, and we may almost say becoming one, there is at once shape. Difference slips in to divide both quantity and quality, and so we have variations in shape and differences of quality. Identity coming in with difference creates equality, difference meanwhile introducing into quantity inequality, whether in number or in magnitude. Thus are produced circles and squares and irregular figures, with number like and unlike, odd and even. The life of intellect is intelligent, and its activity, act, has no failing point. Hence, it excludes none of the constituents we have discovered within it, each one of which we now see as an intellectual function, and all of them possessed by virtue of its distinctive power and in the mode appropriate to intellect. But though intellect possesses them all by way of thought, this is not discursive thought. Nothing it lacks that is capable of serving as reason principle, while it may itself be regarded as one great and perfect reason principle, holding all the principles as one and proceeding from its own primaries, or, rather, having eternally proceeded, so that proceeding is never true of it. It is a universal rule that whatever reasoning discovers to exist in nature is to be found in intellect apart from all ratiocination. We conclude that being has so created intellect that its reasoning is after a mode similar to that of the principles which produce living beings, for the reason principles, prior to reasoning though they are, act invariably in the manner which the most careful reasoning would adopt in order to attain the best results. What conditions, then, are we to think of as existing in that realm which is prior to nature and transcends the principles of nature? In a sphere in which substance is not distinct from intellect, and neither being nor intellect is of alien origin, it is obvious that being is best served by the domination of intellect, so that being is what intellect wills and is. Thus alone can it be authentic and primary being. For if being is to be in any sense derived, its derivation must be from intellect. Being thus exhibits every shape and every quality. It is not seen as a thing determined by some one particular quality. There could not be one only, since the principle of difference is there, and since identity is equally there, it must be simultaneously one and many. And so being is, such it always was, unity with plurality, appears in all its species, as witness all the variations of magnitude, shape, and quality. Clearly nothing may legitimately be excluded from being, for the whole must be complete in the higher sphere, which otherwise would not be the whole. Life, too, burst upon being, or rather was inseparably bound up with it, and thus it was that all living things of necessity came to be. Body, too, was there, since matter and quality were present. Everything exists forever, unfailing, involved by very existence in eternity. Individuals have their separate entities, but are at once in the total unity. The complex, so to speak, of them all, thus combined, is intellect, and intellect, holding all existence within itself, is a complete living being, and the essential idea of living being. Insofar as intellect submits to contemplation by its derivative, becoming an intelligible, it gives that derivative the right also to be called living being. Chapter 22. We may here adduce the pregnant words of Plato. Inasmuch as intellect perceives the variety and plurality of the forms present in the complete living being, the words apply equally to soul. Soul is subsequent to intellect, yet by its very nature it involves intellect in itself, and perceives more clearly in that prior. There is intellect in our intellect also, which again perceives more clearly in its prior, for while of itself it merely perceives, in the prior it perceives its own perception. This intellect, then, to which we ascribe perception, though not divorced from the prior in which it originates, evolves plurality out of unity, and has bound up with it the principle of difference. It therefore takes the form of a plurality in unity. A plurality in unity, it produces the many intellects by the dictate of its very nature. It is certainly no numerical unity, no individual thing, for whatever you find in that sphere is a species, since it is divorced from matter. This may be the import of the difficult words of Plato, that substance is broken up into an infinity of parts, so long as division proceeds from genus to species. Infinity is not reached. A limit is set by the species generated. The lowest species, however, that which is not divided into further species, may be more accurately regarded as infinite. And this is the meaning of the words, to relegate them once and for all to infinity, and there abandon them. As for particulars, they are considered in themselves infinite, but come under number by being embraced by the total unity. Now soul has intellect for its prior. It is therefore circumscribed by number down to its ultimate extremity. At that point, infinity is reached. The particular intellect, though all-embracing, is a partial thing, and the collective intellect and its various manifestations, all the particular intellects, are in actuality parts of that part. Soul, too, is a part of a part, though in the sense of being an act, actuality, derived from it. When the act of intellect is directed upon itself, the result is the manifold particular intellects. When it looks outwards, soul is produced. If soul acts as a genus or a species, the various particular souls must act as species. Their activities, acts, will be twofold. The activity upward is intellect. That which looks downward constitutes the other powers imposed by the particular reason principle, the reason principle of the being ensouled. The lowest activity of soul is its contact with matter, to which it brings form. This lower part of soul does not prevent the rest from being entirely in the higher sphere. Indeed, what we call the lower part is but an image of soul. Not that it is cut off from soul. It is like the reflection in the mirror, depending upon the original which stands outside of it. But we must keep in mind what this outside means. Up to the production of the image, the intellectual realm is wholly and exclusively composed of intellectual beings. In the same way, the sensible world, representing that, insofar as it is able to retain the likeness of a living being, is itself a living being. The relation is like that of a portrait or reflection to the original, which is regarded as prior to the water or the painting reproducing it. The representation, notice, in the portrait or on the water is not of the dual being, but of the one element, matter, as formed by the other, soul. Similarly, this likeness of the intellectual realm carries images not of the creative element, but of the entities contained in that creator, including man, with every other living being. Creator and created are alike living beings, though of a different life, and both coexist in the intellectual realm.